Peace, y'all. I am ICC, and welcome to the 5-Minute Review series. In this episode, I will be taking a look at the Sega CD. It was first released in Japan, and then almost a year later in North America. This is the Model 1 Sega CD with the Model 1 Genesis. The Model 1 Sega CD works with both the Model 1 and the Model 2 Sega Genesis. And the same goes for the Model 2 Sega CD, which came out about a year later in 1993. As you can see on the first Sega CD, it mounts under the Genesis and adds about 3 or 4 inches to the height. The Model 2 Sega CD still mounted under the Genesis, but the disc actually sat next to the console, so it didn't add as much to the height, but it added quite a bit to the width. With both models, you need a power supply. Add this with the power supply to the Sega Genesis and the fact that they are bricks, and it pretty much takes up an entire surge protector. This is not convenient at all, and quite the hassle considering you still have to plug in your TV. In 1994, the Sega CDX was released. This is a Sega CD and a Sega Genesis in one. The power supply is still a brick, but at least it only has one. The Sega CDX also supports the 32X, so if there's any console that I would recommend to play the Sega CD on, it's the Sega CDX. There are other variations of the Sega CD, but they were not made by Sega. You have a couple made by Victor, the Wonder Mega RG M1, and the Wonder Mega RG M2. And last but not least is the Pioneer Laser Active. It retailed at $1,600. So compare that to the Sega CDX and it's a no-brainer. The Sega CD has about 200 games in its library, not including regional doubles, and for the most part, the games on average are not that good. However, there are some great games on the console. The CD format allows for high quality audio and for games to be about 650 megs. Most of the games didn't use the full disc capacity, and that was a bad decision. They could have either added more music, voice acting, or better quality FMVs. The video compression used on the system is not good. The color palette had 512 colors total and allowed for 64 colors on screen at a time. While this may sound like a lot, the Sega Genesis also had 512 colors and allowed 61 colors on the screen instead of 64. That's only 3 more colors. There's almost no noticeable difference when it comes to the color palette and how many colors are allowed on the screen. If you want to compare it to the SNES, the Super Nintendo had 32,768 colors on its color palette and allowed up to 256 colors on the screen at a time. That is 4 times the amount of the Sega CD. Although this was rarely used due to memory limitations, it is the absolute max and was used on some title screens where you won't notice any lag. The audio and music of the Sega CD is one of the best parts of the console. Most of the rest of the systems at the time used cartridges, and carts didn't have the same memory capacity as discs. The reason why Square chose the PlayStation 1 instead of the Nintendo 64 to do Final Fantasy VII is why the Sega CD has better music than its cartridge counterparts. Here we have a quick example. Here's Final Fight for the Sega CD. And here is that same game, the same level on the Super Nintendo. Really no competition if done correctly. The Sega CD should have better music than any Genesis or Super Nintendo game. When comparing some of the graphics, we will use the same game, Final Fight. Considering the color palette that we talked about earlier, the Sega CD did a very good job with the graphics. The SNES version is comparable, so it's not a bad alternative, but I would go with the Sega CD version in this case. One huge plus the Sega CD version has over the Super Nintendo version is the fact that all 3 characters are selectable. The Super Nintendo only has 2 characters. It removed Guy and kept Cody and Hagar. The biggest plus about the Sega CD version is the fact you have 2-player co-op. The SNES version only had a 1-player mode. This reason alone put the Sega CD version on top. Overall, the Sega CD was a little bit disappointing when I was growing up. It had potential, but it was a bit expensive, and it seemed to never really have support. However, there are a few great games on the console, including Sonic CD, Final Fight CD, and two of the best RPG games that Sega has ever been involved with in Lunar Silver Star and Lunar Eternal Blue. I recommend playing the top 5 or 10 games on the console, but after that, the fall off is real. I am ICC. Thank you for watching. Peace.